My marriage ended the instant I saw that red stain inside Richard's lab coat collar. It wasn't wine. It wasn't blood. It was lipstick. And it wasn't mine. In that second, I realized I wasn't just losing a husband. I was about to discover that my entire life with him was built on secrets, coldness, and crimes I could never have imagined. If stories of women who transform pain into strength resonate with you, subscribe now. It's free and helps me bring more accounts like this. Stories based on betrayal, courage, and rebirth. Now take a deep breath. Because what started with a simple lipstick stain is about to turn into the biggest turning point of my life. The day started like any other. Coffee, packed lunchboxes, hurried kisses. I was putting away the laundry when I found Richard's lab coat tossed over the armchair in the closet. I folded it carefully as I always did, until my eyes landed on something discordant. A small red stain right on the inside of the collar. My heart stopped. I leaned closer. It was lipstick. There was no doubt. And it wasn't mine. I tried to find a rational explanation, but they all sounded like flimsy excuses. When he came home that night, I mentioned the stain in the most controlled voice I could manage. He laughed, brushed it off, said it could be from his secretary or an accidental contact at the hospital. The problem was Richard never laughed when he lied, and he laughed too loudly. In that instant, a silent crack opened in everything we called us. During dinner, he complimented my favorite dish as if he were following a protocol. I noticed the way he looked at me without seeing me. How his eyes darted away when I spoke. I began to mentally list other recent absences. He had been coming home late almost every week, and fell asleep even before lying down. There were no more touches. No questions about my day. No smile that used to warm me. Just silence. And that damned lipstick. I tried to convince myself it was tiredness, that the shifts had sucked out what little spontaneity was left. But deep down I knew it was something else. I felt the emptiness taking shape, growing like a shadow between us. The intimacy that once seemed solid now dissolved amidst forced gestures and measured words. We were acting out a marriage. And I hadn't realized the stage had already collapsed. She knew it wasn't hers. In the following days, my eyes began to follow him with an attention I had never exercised before. He continued with the same gestures, the same hours, but there was something different, something absent. It was as if he had switched off human mode and operated by remote control. The kisses were cold, the gazes vague. Even with the children, he seemed impatient, distant. There was no more discussion, no affection. There was routine. And disdain. I started testing him with simple questions, small everyday traps. He responded with an automatic half-smile, always looking at some point behind me, as if I was no longer part of the equation. At night, he pretended to sleep before I approached. In the morning, he left earlier and earlier. And I, who had always been detail-oriented, noticed that even his perfumes had changed. There was no mistake. Someone occupied him inside and out. My thoughts spun in circles. Sometimes I tried to imagine who she was, sometimes I tried not to think at all. The pain was subtle, constant like a low fever. And even without confession, without concrete proof, my heart already knew. The cruelest betrayal is not the one that shouts. It's the one that settles in silence, stealthily, and haunts us in every absence. It was in that silence that I began to lose myself. Outwardly, I continued to play the role of the perfect wife. People still saw us as the model couple. He, the respected surgeon. I, the woman who held the family together. But inside I screamed. And this dissonance between what we were and what we pretended to be made me sick. I felt as if I was being betrayed twice. By him and by myself, who accepted it silently. He was far away even when he was home. That Friday we scheduled a dinner just for the two of us. I needed some indication that there was still something between us. I chose a quiet restaurant, the one where we used to celebrate anniversaries. When he arrived, I noticed he hadn't even changed out of his hospital scrubs. He sat down, picked up the menu, ordered his favorite dish, and didn't ask about mine. I was there, but it could have been anyone. We talked trivialities. Weather, the children's school, next week's schedule. And yet, between one sentence and another, I tried to find his gaze. But he never looked at me for more than 2 seconds. His eyes danced around the room as if searching for someone more interesting. When our eyes finally met, I saw something that devastated me. He felt nothing anymore. No guilt. No regret. No longing. I ordered a glass of wine. He refused. I asked about the hospital, he gave generic answers. I tried to bring up old memories, he deflected. We were face to face, but separated by an invisible wall that only I seemed to notice. I felt a chill. That night wasn't the end. It was the prelude to something much bigger. A whirlpool was forming around us, and I was about to be swallowed whole. When we returned home, he went straight up to the bedroom. I stayed in the living room in silence, staring at my own shadow reflected in the window. Something inside me was beginning to shatter. And yet, I still clung to the hope that I was wrong. But his silence was more eloquent than any scream. Something inside him had already left, and perhaps would never return. Jennifer realized. Something big was coming. I woke up with an inexplicable urgency. Richard was still asleep. I picked up his phone as one might hold a mirror about to crack. I tried the password. Our oldest son's birthday. It unlocked. I opened the apps with trembling fingers. When I reached the messages, I paused. A name repeated itself too frequently, Lauren. I opened the history. What I read took my breath away. Declarations. Laughter. Desires. Codes. The kind of complicity built only with time and intention. Every word seemed designed to wound me. The messages left no doubt. This was not a recent affair. They had plans. They had inside jokes. He called her parallel life. They said the hospital was the perfect disguise. They talked about trips. About secret dinners. About the future. A future where my children and I didn't exist. Time stopped. I felt nauseous. The pain wasn't just anger, it was grief. I went back to the bedroom. He was still sleeping as if the world hadn't turned to dust. I looked at him and wondered how long that man hadn't been mine. What hurt me most wasn't the love between them. It was the fact that he never hesitated to exclude me. I deleted the messages, but every phrase remained etched in my mind like a perverse echo. I was no longer a wife, I was just an obstacle. I didn't cry. Not yet. The shock froze me inside. The betrayal was no longer a supposition. It was a fact. And what would follow I still didn't know. But one thing was certain. The Jennifer of before was already dying. And in her place, a new one was beginning to be born. A woman who would no longer accept being cast aside. A woman who would learn to survive even the sharpest truths. Every word was a stab. I waited until the end of the day. I prepared dinner as usual. The children were playing in the living room. When he came in, I feigned normalcy. But my body trembled inside. After placing the plates on the table, I asked to speak privately. I showed him the phone. He didn't even try to deny it. He looked at me as if reading a report. And then he said without emotion, "I guess you knew this was going to happen." For a moment I thought I was in a nightmare. His coldness cut me more than any revelation. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to justify. He merely announced that he wanted a divorce. Like someone ending a contract. He said our marriage had ended a long time ago, and he was ready to move on. The words fell like stones. And he, impassive, seemed relieved to finally be rid of the performance. I asked about the children. He said he would take care of the finances but didn't want to discuss custody at that moment. His indifference stunned me. I had imagined a fight, a plea, anything that showed it at least hurt. But he seemed to be talking about a shift change at the hospital. In that instant, I understood that I had been discarded like a stained lab coat. I stood there still as he went upstairs to pack. I didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside me broke irreversibly. The woman I had been for 15 years was being buried. Without flowers. Without a farewell. Just the certainty that the love we built had been contaminated by a coldness I could never forget. He said, "I guess you knew this was going to happen." Night fell like a heavy curtain. After he left, I walked through the house as if searching for traces of myself. I touched my children's toys, straightened the fallen pillow, closed the windows. The world spun outside, but inside me everything had stopped. I sat on the kitchen floor and stared into nothingness. My body was there, but my soul seemed to float above me, watching in silence. The sound of the back door brought me back. It was my youngest son asking for milk. I looked at him, so small, so oblivious to the devastation. I smiled with difficulty and prepared the cup. I hugged all three that night tightly, trying to transfer to them the courage I still lacked. I couldn't break. Not now. They needed me whole. And for them, I would learn to put my pieces back together. I went to the bedroom and lay down alone. The pillow beside me still held his scent. I took a deep breath and held back my tears. Tomorrow would be another day. And I would have to wake up and pretend everything was fine for them. For me. The woman I was becoming was still a rough draft, but she already existed. And this woman would not allow the end to be her last chapter. I closed my eyes and made a silent promise. My pain would not be in vain. And even without knowing how, I would find a way to transform it all into strength. Because from that day on, my mission was clear. To survive. And to fight. She looked at her children and knew. She couldn't fall apart. The following week, I sought out Allison Clark, a lawyer recommended by an old friend. I went to her office with a thin folder, but I left with a storm in my chest. Upon hearing my story, Allison suggested we check for possible suspicious financial movements. With access to Richard's CPF and a contact in the banking sector, we cross-referenced information. That's how the name appeared. Clearview Holdings. A company he had never mentioned. Perfect hiding place. Gradually, documents emerged like debris after an explosion. Contracts, transfers, and acquisitions in Clearview's name. Richard had been moving money out of our joint assets for at least 2 years. It wasn't just preparation for separation. It was a strategic escape. He camouflaged assets, shielded accounts, removed traces. The image of the meticulous man now became that of a cold strategist, planning my annulment in advance. I felt invaded, as if he had dismantled my life with the coldness of someone performing surgery. Every transferred amount was a stab to the chest. Allison remained objective, but I had to take a deep breath with each new discovery. It was much more than adultery. It was a meticulous architecture of exclusion, a plan built behind the scenes of our home, while I washed dishes, signed school notebooks, and dreamed of the future. For the first time, I understood that the betrayal wasn't just intimate, it was institutional. Richard was erasing me from the records, from possessions, from his history. I was no longer part of anything, neither love, nor assets, nor the narrative he was rewriting for the world. And that hurt with an intensity no farewell letter could convey. I wasn't being left behind. I was being deleted. It was as if he had planned the escape. Clearview Holdings owned properties, offshore accounts, and contracts with the very clinic where Richard worked. Everything meticulously separated from his name, but traceable. The strategy was too sophisticated to be improvised. Richard had used third parties, shell companies, and even a trusted proxy to mask the operations. With each document, his coldness became clearer. Allison assembled a financial map based on the evidence obtained. It was a dirty puzzle, and each piece revealed how much he had dehumanized me in this process. We were no longer a family. I was an obstacle, and my children merely logistical appendages to be contained. My blood boiled, but more than anger, what I felt was humiliation. He was stripping me of assets, plans, history, like erasing a wrong word. I started mentally revisiting the last few years. The overwork, the excuses for trips, the bank statements that seemed like busy doctor stuff. Everything made sense now. The romantic betrayal was just the surface. The moral betrayal was the true abyss. Richard didn't love me. He discarded me. Systematically. Silently. Legally. And that wasn't just cruelty. It was perversity. For a moment I wanted to break everything. To scream, destroy, disappear. But I held back the emotion like holding my breath underwater. Allison looked at me seriously and said, "You have an advantage now. He thinks you're still blind." That brought me clarity. For the first time I understood that knowledge could be a weapon, and I was about to use it. I would no longer be the victim of the story. He was erasing me in every way. I returned home with a new mission. Gather evidence, organize documents, devise a plan. I opened folders, revisited old emails, searched for receipts. I spoke to the accountant who had served us years ago. I rummaged through forgotten files in the home office. Every detail was valuable. The lie was not just in the words, it was in the subtext of everyday life. And now I was attentive to every single one. I created a chart with dates, values, names, and locations. The picture was clear. Richard had begun cleaning his own trail even before getting involved with Lauren. He was already preparing his new life, and I was an item that needed to be removed from his baggage. The pain fueled me, but this time not like poison, like fuel. I wouldn't let him bury my story without resistance. I told Allison about my decision. We would assemble a complete dossier. Proof of financial, emotional, and legal betrayal. I didn't want a scandal. I wanted justice. I needed to prove not just to the world but to myself that I wasn't weak. That I saw, understood, and reacted. That my story wouldn't end in the footnote of a divorce proceeding. I would rewrite this story my way. I spent sleepless nights cataloging everything. Every new document was one more step toward what I called reclaiming myself. It wasn't for revenge. It was for reparation. Because when everything is taken from us, love, name, ground, all that's left is to build a new foundation. And mine would begin by proving who Richard truly was. She didn't want revenge, she wanted justice. He called me on a cloudy afternoon. Dr. Matthew Hayes. The name sounded familiar. An old residency colleague of Richard's. He said he needed to talk to me. Personally and in confidence. We arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, out of the city center. When he arrived, he wore a heavy expression. He didn't smile. He didn't ask how I was. He just said, "You need to know something before it's too late." I sat across from him with a knot in my stomach. Hayes ordered a short coffee but didn't touch the cup. He looked around as if being watched. Then, he leaned in and said he had discovered what Richard had been doing at the clinic. Words like fraud, sample substitution, genetic manipulation began to emerge. He spoke softly, but every sentence sounded like thunder inside me. I could barely breathe. He handed me an envelope with copies of emails and internal reports. He said Richard was involved in a scheme of deliberate substitution of in vitro fertilization samples. That hundreds of families could have been affected. That Richard used his own genetic material in many of these cases. And then, as if dropping a bomb on the table, Hayes mentioned his genetic condition. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. My ears rang. My head spun. My children were born through assisted insemination. I always thought the donor was anonymous. I always trusted what Richard said. And now, that man implied that all three could have been victims of their own father. The man who had betrayed me on every level. The doctor who skirted ethics as casually as signing a prescription. What if my children carried that gene? What if everything was a lie? He seemed to carry a weight on his chest. I went home in a trance. I remembered my pregnancies, the exams, the consultations, everything Richard insisted on controlling. He always said it was better that way, that he would take care of everything. And I, in love and trusting, allowed it. Now everything made sense. He placed himself at the center of everything, even the birth of our children. The thought made me nauseous. It was more than ego. It was sickness. It was a crime. I rummaged through documents, memories, notebooks. I tried to remember if he ever told me anything that now sounded like a disguised confession. The only thing I found was emptiness. The silence he always kept. The subtle manipulation. And the total control. There was no doubt. I needed to know. I needed to be sure. And for that, there was only one possible way. The DNA test. I spoke to Allison the next morning. She recommended total discretion. The request was made under a fictitious name. I took hair samples from the boys, a piece of a toothbrush, a strand of Richard's beard that I kept in an old box. The lab was discreet. The process almost clandestine. I walked on shards of glass. But I couldn't stop. Truth was a blade. If it cuts, it liberates. I waited outside the lab as one awaits their own destiny. My eyes were dry, but my soul trembled. It wasn't just a doubt I needed to clear. It was my entire life that was at stake. The woman who had entered there was no longer the same one who believed in Sunday dinners and wedding anniversaries. She now sought something greater than love, truth. What if my children are not his? For the next few days I could barely eat. Every touch from the children gave me a knot in my throat. Their smiles, the way they played, the color of their eyes. Everything began to seem like a clue. But at the same time I loved them more than ever. Nothing would change that. Not a positive result. Not a devastating discovery. But I needed to know. I needed to put an end to the doubt that devoured me. I started to mentally organize what I would do with the result, whatever it might be. I thought about the doctors, the school, the legal implications. But I also thought about myself. About how I would face my own story if I discovered I had been deceived from day one. Richard had crossed every possible line. And now I stood at the last threshold. To know the truth and to carry it. The children were asleep when the lab called. The voice was neutral. It informed me that the results would be ready the next day. I thanked them, holding my breath. I walked to the bedroom, kissed each one on the forehead, and sat on the edge of the bed hugging my own knees. The night was cold and my soul even colder. But I knew. There were things that couldn't be ignored, nor postponed. And this was one of them. I lay sleepless. My eyes wouldn't close. My body wouldn't rest. But my spirit was already preparing for what was to come. Because no matter how much it hurt, the truth was the only way for me to start over. And this time I would start over without lies, without illusions, without the weight of doubt. The truth could destroy me, but it was in it that my liberation would begin. The truth could destroy her, but she needed to know. The envelope arrived on a gray morning, as if the sky knew it contained a sentence. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. I sat at the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and opened the papers. The names were there: Richard Evans, my 3 children, and the cold conclusions of a laboratory test. I read it once, twice, 3 times. The result was unquestionable. Richard was not the biological father. The world spun. I felt my body dissolve into the chair. A heat rose through my temples and the room lost its shape. It was as if I had taken an invisible blow, cutting me from the inside without leaving marks. I cried silently, just tears streaming down, defenseless. My children, fruits of a love that was now disintegrating, were victims like me. Victims of a dirty game, of unforgivable manipulation. And they didn't even know. I stayed there for hours, unmoving. The paper still in my hands, as proof that my life had been a cruel experiment. I remembered the ultrasounds, the first kicks in my belly, the sleepless nights cradling fevers. Every memory now seemed contaminated by a lie. But deep down, nothing changed the love I felt. They were my children. They always would be. With or without Richard's blood. I slowly got up, put the papers in a black folder, and went upstairs. I kissed each one still sleeping. Their quiet breaths were the only thing anchoring me. I decided then they didn't need to know. Not yet. Maybe never. The pain was mine. The responsibility mine. And if I wanted to protect them, I would have to be stronger than I had ever been. The woman who stood up now was different. Fractured but standing. The paper trembled in her hands. The following days were a minefield. Every smile from the children, every innocent question cut me. I watched them with a heavy heart, but with a love that seemed to grow twofold. It was as if the instinct of protection had multiplied. They were not to blame for anything. And I would never allow them to carry the shame of a lie they did not build. I would be a shield. I would be a wall. I cried in silence in the bathroom when they were already asleep. I tried to appear normal, to maintain the routine. The lunchboxes, the school schedules, the homework. Everything continued as if nothing had changed. But inside me there was a constant earthquake. The only thing that prevented me from falling was the fact that I now had a purpose. To discover the extent of the damage. And to expose Richard. I told Allison. Her expression hardened. This could be the central piece of the case, she said. But even so, she respected my wish to keep the boys out of it. We organized the documents, reinforced digital security. Richard still didn't know I had evidence. And that was my advantage. I would use his arrogance against him. Silence now was my best strategy. Every night, I returned to that black folder and reread the report. Part of me still hoped the words would change. That it was a mistake. But it wasn't. The truth was irrefutable. And painful. But it was also liberating. Because now more than ever I knew what I was facing. He was not just a traitor. He was a criminal. And he would not go unpunished. They didn't need to know. Yet, with shock transformed into determination, I plunged into the investigation. I revisited every contact, every folder, every suspicion. The pieces began to fit together. Richard was not operating alone. Someone was helping him. Someone was signing documents. Someone was turning a blind eye. And I needed to find that person. I knew that somewhere in the clinic more truths were buried. And it was time to unearth them. I used everything I had learned from Allison. I searched for records, cross-referenced dates, strange invoices. There was no more room for naivete. I moved like a strategist, and every detail led me deeper into the rottenness he had built. Discovering that my children were part of a scheme was the cruelest wound. But now I knew the size of the monster I needed to bring down. It was as if, finally, I saw the enemy whole. It wasn't just Richard. It was the system that covered for him. The clinic. The falsified papers. The walls of silence. And amidst all this, I, a wounded woman, but with a strength he would never imagine. Because whoever has lost everything has no more fear. And whoever has no fear is dangerous. I had a new role: to unmask him. I went back to the office and reorganized the dossier. I added the DNA test results. I rewrote the timeline. I marked the names that began to appear too frequently. The puzzle was taking shape. And I was about to discover the missing piece. The one that would make everything irrefutable. And when that happened, there would be no more running. No more denying. He would fall. If he deceived so many families, he wouldn't go unpunished. The call came from an unknown number. A tense voice asked, "Is this Jennifer Collins?" "I'm Diane Reynolds, a nurse at Fertilise Clinic." My heart raced. She seemed nervous but determined. She said she knew what Richard had done. That she couldn't carry that secret any longer. And that she wanted to show me something. We met in a discreet parking lot at night. When she arrived, she carried a worn folder in her arms. Inside was what I hadn't even dared to dream of: evidence. She opened the diary right there, in the dim light of the street lamp. Handwritten notebooks, dated pages, tables. There were notes about procedures, sample codes, and most seriously, substitutions. Each page had names, times, and on many Richard's signature. Diane had kept everything. Out of fear. Out of guilt. And now she decided to hand it over. My eyes couldn't stop scanning those lines. I was trembling. It was all there. Finally. She said she tried to report it years ago, but was silenced. That she saw couples crying because they couldn't conceive, unaware they had been deceived. That Richard did it naturally, as if it were routine. She herself was almost fired when they suspected she was keeping records. But now, seeing my case, she decided it was time to stop being afraid. That if he had destroyed so many lives, she could no longer remain silent. I hugged Diane tightly. She cried. I did too. That moment was the turning point. Because it was one thing to suspect. It was another to hold the written, signed, and stamped truth in my hands. I went home with the folder clutched to my chest, like holding a baby. With each step, I felt something in me realigning. Now I had more than pain. I had evidence. And with it, justice would come. Everything was documented. I arrived home and laid the notebooks on the office table. Every page seemed to scream. The dates coincided with important phases of my life. One in particular was from the month I conceived my oldest son. The sample swap was there. Name, time, substitution, and Richard's signature. It was impossible not to feel my heart crumble. But along with the pain, something new was born: power. I spent the night organizing everything. I digitized the pages. I created physical and digital copies. Allison helped me remotely, reviewing the documents. The dossier's structure gained strength. With the DNA, the bank records, and now the diary, we had a solid case. It was no longer a betrayed woman fighting for dignity. It was a concrete denunciation, with the potential to bring down an entire institution. I reviewed everything 3 times, as if I was afraid the evidence would disappear. But it wouldn't. It was there. In every line. In every signature. Diane had given me more than a diary. She had given me back the chance to fight with real tools. To step out of the victim's shadow and assume the role of accuser. That's what Richard never imagined. That the silence he planted would one day become a scream. The next morning, I took the documents to Allison. She barely hid her enthusiasm. "With this, we'll bring everything down," she said. And then calmly, like someone opening the last door, she suggested, "We need something more. Something he says himself. Something that buries any doubt." I knew immediately what she meant. It was time to hear his voice. And record it. It was time to hunt him with his own tongue. Now she had a real weapon. Allison mapped out the plan with surgical precision. We would use my next conversation with Richard to extract confessions. I would have to provoke him, make him believe he was still in control. Microphones would be hidden in the room. The environment would be set like a stage, and he, unknowingly, would be the main actor in his own downfall. I felt scared, but also a strange excitement. It was dangerous, but it was necessary. I reviewed every point of the script. I studied his reactions. I thought about the phrases that irritated him most, the triggers that destabilized him. I knew him too well. I knew how to pressure without raising suspicion. It was risky, but it was my only chance to get a confession. And at that moment I had nothing left to lose. I was the woman he tried to erase. And now I returned as both shadow and light. I went to the closet and retrieved the box containing our old wedding rings. Inside, I hid the listening device. I put on the microphone necklace and concealed the wires. I took a deep breath in front of the mirror. The woman staring back at me was made of scars, but also of purpose. I was ready. That conversation wouldn't just be about the past. It would be about the fall. His fall. And the beginning of my victory. That night, the house would be the silent courtroom where the truth would begin to be recorded. And he, unknowingly, would take the first step toward his own abyss. Because it wasn't just my story at stake anymore. It was that of dozens of families. It was justice stifled by years of silence. It was pain transformed into a sentence. It was time to hear it from his mouth. The next morning was silent and methodical. The house seemed complicit in what was to come. I hid the microphones with steady hands, but my heart raced. One on the bookshelf, another inside the speaker. Every wire tested, every position revised. Allison had taught me how to record everything legally. I needed him to talk, and every word had to be clear. That day the stage was set. I chose a simple, discreet dress, almost domestic. I wanted to appear vulnerable, as he was used to seeing me. I called and said we needed to talk about the boys. Richard accepted with his usual coldness. We arranged to meet in the late afternoon. I spent the day rehearsing mentally. I couldn't make a mistake. The window of truth would be short. And if I stumbled, I would lose everything. When he arrived, I showed cordiality. He sat on the sofa, confident, dominant. I talked about the children's school vaccinations until, slowly, I touched upon the clinic. I asked if he felt guilty. He laughed. He said he did what was necessary. That he wasn't the only one. And that no one cares if the result is a healthy baby. My blood ran cold. Then he mentioned his own genetic condition as something that didn't affect anything. And he confessed, yes, he used his genetic material. My mouth went dry. My eyes burned, but I maintained control. He spoke as if in a bar, telling immoral stories to impress. And unknowingly, he revealed every detail. The substitutions. The accomplices. The entire system he had created to act with impunity. I just nodded, encouraging him to continue. Every sentence he uttered was another brick in the wall of his own condemnation. And I was there, recording every second. She couldn't make a mistake. After he left, I locked the door with trembling hands. I went straight to the computer, connected the devices, and saved the audio files in multiple backups. The sound of his voice was clear. His words carried not only guilt but the arrogance of someone who never believed he would be caught. I called Allison immediately. When she heard the excerpts, she was silent for long seconds. Then she said, "That's it." He buried himself. We prepared the submission to the hospital's ethics committee. Everything with caution. The recording, the nurse's diary, the test results. Allison formatted an unbeatable dossier. I observed each step like someone watching a birth. We were about to give birth to the truth. A truth that would drag down a reputation, a name, an entire institution. And yet, the weight I felt was not of revenge, it was of justice. The protocol was delivered in person with a signed receipt. The hospital promised a confidential analysis and an extraordinary convocation. Meanwhile, Allison also activated the legal proceedings. Richard's fall would not only be moral, it would be legal. I walked through the streets with the certainty that, finally, the truth was about to leave the underground. And when it emerged, no one could stop it. I returned home, sat by the window, and took a deep breath. For years, I wondered if I would ever have a voice. Now, I not only had a voice, I had evidence. And with it, I would tear down the statue that so many applauded without knowing the truth. The man who shared my bed for 15 years would be judged. Not by me but by the world. Every word was a nail in his own coffin. The city seemed unaware of what was approaching. But I knew. And Allison knew. The process had already begun. The medical commission, the ethics committee, the judges. The hospital could no longer protect its best surgeon. Richard still smiled in the corridors, posed for photos, spoke at events. But his days were numbered. And every step he took was now followed by the shadows of the truths he himself confessed. For years I thought my pain was too small compared to his greatness. Now I realized how fragile he was, and how much I had grown. The woman who once believed in eternal love now fought for eternal justice. Not just for me, but for every deceived family, for every betrayed patient, for every child born under false promises. I was just the first to scream. I felt something inside me change. For the first time I didn't carry just resentment, I carried purpose. The pain had transformed into a kind of power. A silent but unbreakable power. Richard may have taken my dreams, but now I was taking his mask. And I wouldn't stop until everyone saw it fall. Because the truth, when it arrives, doesn't ask permission. It invades. And at that moment I understood. What began as a marital betrayal was now becoming a public wound. The scandal was not just within four walls. It was institutional. It was ethical. It was social. And my voice finally ceased to be a whisper, to become an accusation. What was personal became institutional. I didn't expect to see her so soon. Lauren Mitchell appeared at my doorstep, her face pale and her eyes sunken. I hesitated before letting her in. It still hurt to look at her, to know she shared the same man who promised me eternity. But there was something different in her demeanor. A sincere urgency. She sat on the sofa, pulled an old photo from her bag and said, "He killed my mother. And I came to tell you why." I remained silent. She began to speak. Her mother had been Richard's patient. A simple surgery, which ended in covered-up complications. Lauren was a medical resident at the time. She knew something was wrong, but Richard convinced the hospital to close the case. Over time she discovered the truth behind the scenes. Negligence. And she vowed revenge. Getting close to him, gaining his trust was part of the plan. The pieces began to make sense. She wasn't just a lover. She was an infiltrator. The woman who took my husband was also destroying him from within. A cruel paradox but undeniable. Lauren hated Richard. And she used the only path he wouldn't resist, ego. I was overwhelmed by a mix of anger and compassion. She wounded my heart, but her pain was also real. And as absurd as it seemed, we were on the same side now. I took a deep breath. Still with a broken heart, I extended my hand. For the first time I saw in Lauren something beyond rivalry. Humanity. We were united by pain, by loss, and by a thirst for justice. It wasn't friendship. It was survival. And at that moment I understood that alone I had evidence. But with her I would have access. The final key to close the net. She was not just the mistress. In the following days we worked together. She brought me copies of messages, internal clinic records, parallel schedules. She helped organize the schedule for the hospital's annual gala. We knew Richard would be honored, which made the event the perfect stage for his downfall. Allison, always precise, reiterated, "It's risky, but if executed well, it will be irrefutable." And that's what we wanted. Irrefutable. Lauren used her influence to confirm timings and access. I handled the dossiers. The two of us, in silence, arranged an orchestra. It was strange to trust her. But at the same time, I had never trusted anyone as much as I did in that moment. There was something liberating in looking at someone who had also been destroyed, and choosing to rebuild together. What united us was stronger than what separated us. We spent sleepless nights in secret meetings. Ballroom maps, guest names, evening schedule. The police and the ethics committee would be alerted in advance. The evidence would be discreetly handed to the board members in the middle of the party. Lauren guaranteed. "He suspects nothing." And I believed her. Because Richard's biggest mistake was always underestimating the women around him. When everything was ready, I looked at that plan with a tightening in my chest. The woman who had started this journey as a wounded wife was now the architect of truth. Lauren, the mistress, was now an accomplice in the exposure. What Richard built with lies we would tear down with facts. And the gala would not just be an event, it would be a verdict. It was time to put the final pieces together. The week of the gala arrived. Richard rehearsed speeches. The staff prepared toasts and tributes. The hospital celebrated him as a hero of medicine. But we knew that behind the lab coat was a monster. The ballroom would be decorated with flowers and lights. But in the shadows, the fall would be inevitable. The last act of his farce would be staged there, before applause that would turn into shock. Lauren would handle the delivery of documents to the board members. I would notify the police. The coordination had to be perfect. Every second calculated. Every step rehearsed. It was as if we were organizing not an exposure, but a symbolic execution. And by the end of that night, Richard would not leave as he arrived. The celebrated man would leave in handcuffs. And the victims finally would have a voice. I reviewed all the material one last time. The dossier was complete. DNA, recordings, diary, accounting evidence, denunciations. There were no more flaws. Richard would have nowhere to run. And the hospital, complicit by omission, would also have to answer. For the first time in a long time I felt peace. A cold but deep peace. Because now justice ceased to be a wish, and became inevitable. I leaned against the door of the room and looked at the dress I would wear. It would not be black. It would not be for mourning. It would be red. The color of truth, of pain, of courage. And when the spotlights came on that night, Richard would see who was center stage. And it wouldn't be him. The brightest night would be the darkest for him. The main hall of the hospital was transformed into a showcase of luxury and prestige. Warm lights, impeccably decorated tables, crystal glasses shimmering under the spotlights. It was the annual gala, and Richard, as usual, would be honored for his ethics and dedication. He wore his best suit, smiled for the flashes, shook hands like a politician on the campaign trail. The public applauded. The institution celebrated. But everything there was a facade. I walked among the guests with a discreet smile, wearing the red dress I had chosen as a symbol. No one suspected. I was just the discreet ex-wife, the woman who still maintained her composure. Richard ignored me, surrounded by colleagues and admirers. As he spoke about commitment to medicine, I watched the applause echo like cruel irony. The truth, silent, approached like an invisible fire. At the exact moment Lauren and I separated, she circulated among the board members, distributing sealed envelopes. Each contained copies of the dossier. DNA tests, diaries, recordings, financial records. Documents organized with surgical precision. One by one, the gazes of the men and women in lab coats changed. I read in their faces disbelief, contained anger, disappointment. The glass castle began to crack, and Richard didn't even notice. Some board members moved away. Others exchanged discreet words among themselves. The police, already alerted, waited in silence. Everything happened according to plan. That hall, until then a space of celebration, became a stage for revelation. And as the orchestra played its last song, I knew that was Richard's last night as a free man. Justice would not arrive with screams, but with silent, precise steps. The world applauded the wrong man. During the dinner break, I walked to the garden of the hall. I breathed the cold night air and looked at the city in the distance, oblivious to what was about to happen. The dossier was already in the right hands. The impact calculated. There was no longer any way to control the narrative. For the first time, the system that had protected him for so long began to crumble from within. And he didn't even notice. He remained upright, smiling, ignorant of his own destiny. I returned to the hall and saw board members whispering with committee members. I saw cell phones being used in a hurry, emails being checked, serious expressions replacing smiles. Richard was still speaking, talking about legacy and commitment. It was almost poetic. The man who built a reputation on lies was now speaking of integrity, while the walls around trembled with the truth finally exposed. I sat at my table and exchanged a quick glance with Lauren. There was relief in our eyes, but also a strange sadness. Because even if he paid for everything, what we lost would never return. She lost a mother, an entire life, and hundreds of families, the chance to know the truth from the beginning. Justice was necessary, but it didn't erase the pain. When the gala ended, I left in silence. Richard was still talking to colleagues. unaware that this would be his last night as a symbol of something he never was. I got into the car with peace in my heart. The next step was already defined. The institutional complaint had been made. The recording delivered. The police notified. The arrest would happen in another setting, and I would witness the end he himself chose. One by one the gazes changed. That same night, Allison confirmed. The warrant was ready. The arrest would be carried out the next day, in a public place with witnesses. It was symbolic. It was necessary. And I agreed. The time had come to close the cycle. To look into the eyes of the man who destroyed so many lives, and say without words that he did not win. The system that protected him for years would now be the engine of his downfall. I returned home and prepared the final scene. A dinner like so many others. But this one with the taste of an ending. I called Richard. I talked about the boys. I said I wanted to end everything peacefully for them. He accepted, as always, thinking he was in control. Little did he know that, this time, I was the one directing the script. The protagonist was no longer a supporting character. And the final act was already written. I organized the restaurant, prepared the envelope. Inside the DNA tests, a copy of the recording, a brief letter. It was simple. No shouts. No explanations. Only truths that, read or heard, would allow no escape. When he sat across from me, there would be no more masks. Only the reflection of everything he built with lies, vanity, and power. And when the clock struck the exact hour, the police would enter. And then the cycle would close. From the lipstick on the lab coat to the sound of handcuffs. From betrayed wife to the voice of justice. From silence to revelation. And as the city slept, I rehearsed my goodbye. The arrest was scheduled for the next night. The restaurant was small, elegant, and discreet. I chose a table near the window, with a view of the street where cars passed in a slow line. The waiters were informed, the timings adjusted. I arrived early, with the envelope in my purse and my nerves under control. When Richard entered, he wore his usual suit and the same smile, that of someone who believes they have one. He sat down, thanked me for the invitation, and asked about the boys. I answered with serenity. I ordered wine, commented on trivialities. The game required everything to seem natural. He settled in, opened the menu, and commented on the previous night's gala, unaware that he had signed his own sentence between toasts and applause. When the dishes arrived, I took a deep breath and took the envelope from my purse. I slid it across the table without saying a word. He looked at it strangely. He opened it. And he read. First the tests. Then the transcript of the recording. Finally the letter. I watched his expression slowly change. From arrogance to discomfort. From discomfort to panic. He paled before finishing his wine. He tried to speak, but I silenced him with a gesture. It's all there, I simply said. He knew there was no point in denying it. The evidence spoke. And his silence was now the only sensible thing left. The door opened. 2 police officers approached discreetly. They showed him the documents. He tried to stand up but didn't resist. He was handcuffed in front of the customers, in front of me. No words. No protest. Just the metallic sound of truth binding him. I stood up. Picked up my purse. And before he could say anything, I turned my back. Jennifer stood up and left without looking back. Now, I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you experienced something similar? Support the channel, subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I'm leaving another story on the final screen that you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.